What happens when Hollywood royalty clashes with late-night television's most beloved host? In just 38 seconds, one comment would unravel an entire interview and end with a guest being escorted off the set in front of a live studio audience. This is the story of how Meghan Markle's appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live turned from a casual chat into one of the most shocking moments in talk show history. The evening started like any other taping. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his quick wit and warm personality, greeted the audience with his signature smile. The guests for tonight included a mix of celebrities, but the main event was clear. Meghan Markle was scheduled to sit down for what producers called a lighthearted conversation about her recent projects. Backstage, the energy was buzzing. Production assistants rushed around making final checks. The makeup team had finished their work. Everything seemed ready for what should have been just another celebrity interview, the kind Jimmy had done thousands of times before. The show's producer had briefed Jimmy earlier about the talking points. Keep it light. Ask about her charity work. Maybe mention her podcast. Throw in some fun questions about life in California. Standard stuff. Nothing controversial. Nothing that would cause problems. Jimmy had nodded along, reviewing his note cards. He'd done his research. He knew about her various projects, her public statements, her recent media appearances. He was prepared for a normal interview. What he wasn't prepared for was what was about to happen. As the band played her entrance music, Meghan walked onto the stage wearing an elegant cream-colored dress. The audience applauded politely. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, extending his hand for a handshake. She took it briefly, then settled into the guest chair. "Welcome to the show," Jimmy said, his tone friendly and relaxed. "Thanks for being here." Meghan smiled, adjusting herself in the chair. "Thank you for having me." The first few minutes went smoothly enough. Jimmy asked about her recent charity work, and she answered with practiced ease, discussing her various projects and initiatives. The audience seemed engaged, laughing at the appropriate moments when Jimmy cracked a joke. "You've been involved with several organizations focused on women's rights," Jimmy said, glancing at his notes. "That must be really fulfilling work." "It is," Meghan replied, and though her smile seemed forced. "When you're actually doing the work and not just talking about it." Jimmy nodded, not quite catching the edge in her voice. "Absolutely. And you're also working on content creation, right? Podcasts, documentaries, that sort of thing." "Yes," Meghan said. "Creating content that actually matters. Content with substance." Again, there was something in her tone. Jimmy shifted slightly in his chair, sensing that something was off, but trying to push forward. "So," Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair, "I have to ask. You've been in the public eye for quite some time now. What's the strangest thing a fan has ever said to you?" It was a simple question, the kind talk show hosts ask all the time, an easy setup for a funny story. But Meghan's expression shifted slightly. "Well," she began, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "I think the strangest thing is when people assume they know me based on what they read in tabloids. People like to make assumptions." Jimmy nodded, trying to steer the conversation back to lighter territory. "Sure, I can imagine that's frustrating. But I meant more like, has anyone ever stopped you on the street and said something really weird or funny?" Meghan crossed her arms. "I don't really find those interactions funny, Jimmy. When you're constantly being watched and judged, every interaction feels invasive." The audience fell quiet. This wasn't the playful banter they'd come to expect. Jimmy, ever the professional, tried again. "Of course, I understand. Let's talk about something else. You've been working on a new podcast, right? Tell us about that." Meghan shifted in her seat. "Yes, my podcast. It's a platform where I can finally speak my truth without being edited or misrepresented. Unlike traditional media, which constantly twists my words." Jimmy raised his eyebrows slightly but maintained his composure. "Well, that sounds great. What kind of topics do you cover?" "Important topics," Meghan said, her tone growing more pointed. "Topics that matter, Not the superficial nonsense that gets pushed on late-night television. A few audience members gasped. Jimmy's smile tightened, but he kept his cool. Well, we try to balance entertainment and important conversations here, Jimmy said calmly. Sometimes people just need a laugh after a long day. Meghan let out a small, dismissive laugh. A laugh. Right. While the world is dealing with real issues, we're supposed to just laugh it all away. Jimmy sat forward. Bah, I think laughter can be healing, actually. It doesn't mean we don't care about serious things. We cover those topics too. Do you, Meghan challenged, or do you just make fun of people for entertainment? There's a difference. The tension in the studio was thick now. Even the cameramen looked uncomfortable. Jimmy took a breath, clearly trying to keep the interview from spiraling further. Listen, Jimmy said, his voice still even. I respect your perspective, but I've been doing this for a long time, and I think our show serves a purpose. People tell me all the time that we help them get through tough times. Meghan scoffed. Help them? By distracting them from reality? That's not helping, Jimmy. That's avoidance. I disagree, Jimmy replied, his patience wearing thin, but his professionalism still intact. I think bringing people together for a shared experience, making them smile, that's valuable. Valuable to your ratings, maybe, Meghan shot back. The audience murmured. This was getting uncomfortable. Jimmy's producer, watching from backstage, looked concerned. Jimmy held up a hand, trying to defuse the situation. Look, we don't have to agree on everything. That's okay. Different perspectives make the world interesting. How diplomatic, Meghan said sarcastically. Is that what you tell yourself when you avoid having real discussions? Jimmy's smile faded. We have real discussions all the time. We've had politicians on here, activists, journalists. We talk about serious topics regularly. Between comedy sketches and celebrity gossip, Meghan added. Yes, between those things, Jimmy said, a hint of frustration entering his voice. Because this is a variety show. That's the format. That's what people tune in for. Exactly, Meghan said. Give the people what they want, right? Keep them entertained. Keep them from thinking too hard. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, studying her. You seem to have a lot of contempt for entertainment, which is interesting, considering you're in the entertainment industry yourself. I'm in the business of creating meaningful content, Meghan corrected. There's a difference. And you don't think anything we do here is meaningful, Jimmy stated. It wasn't a question. Meghan shrugged. I think you have potential to do more, but you choose not to. You choose the easy path. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was supposed to be fun. This was supposed to be entertaining. Instead, not fun. They were watching their beloved host get criticized and insulted. Okay, Jimmy said, clearly trying to move forward. Let's talk about something else. You mentioned earlier that you're passionate about environmental causes. What are you working on in that area? Meghan looked at him like he'd just asked the most ridiculous question in the world. What am I working on? Everything, Jimmy. Unlike some people who just talk about issues, I actually do something about them. Jimmy's jaw tightened. I'm sure you do great work. I don't need your validation, Meghan said coolly. I wasn't offering it, Jimmy replied, a hint of frustration finally creeping into his voice. I was trying to have a conversation. A conversation? Meghan laughed. This isn't a conversation. This is you trying to control the narrative. Just like everyone else in this industry. Jimmy set his note cards down on the desk with a bit more force than usual. With all due respect, I invited you here to talk about your projects, to give you a platform. I'm not trying to control anything. A platform? Meghan's voice rose. You think I need your platform? I have my own voice, Jimmy. I don't need late-night television to legitimize me. Then why did you agree to come on the show? Jimmy asked, his tone still controlled, but clearly exasperated. Meghan paused, seemingly caught off guard by the directness of the question. Because I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd be different. But you're just like all the rest. Different how? Jimmy pressed. What exactly were you expecting? I was expecting respect, Meghan said sharply. I was expecting to be treated like an intelligent person, not just another celebrity you can make jokes about. Jimmy leaned forward, his eyes serious. I haven't made a single joke at your expense tonight. Not one. I've asked you straightforward questions about your work. If that feels disrespectful to you, I honestly don't know what to say. Meghan crossed her arms again. Your questions are designed to trivialize what I do. Asking about fan encounters? Really? That's the best you could come up with? It's a light-hearted question, Jimmy explained, his patience clearly being tested. It's meant to be fun. That's what this show is. Fun. Fun, Meghan repeated mockingly. While people are suffering, while the planet is dying, while injustice runs rampant, you want to have fun. Jimmy took a deep breath. Yes, actually. Because if we spend every second of every day drowning in darkness, we'll lose our minds. There's room for both serious discussion and moments of levity. Spoken like someone who's never really struggled, Meghan said coldly. The audience gasped again, louder this time. That comment had crossed a line. Jimmy's expression hardened. Excuse me, Jimmy said, his voice low. You heard me, Meghan continued. People like you, sitting in your comfortable studios, making millions. You don't understand what real struggle is. Jimmy stared at her for a moment. You don't know anything about my life. You don't know what I've been through, or where I came from. I know enough, Meghan said dismissively. No, you don't, Jimmy replied firmly. And frankly, it's pretty presumptuous of you to make those kinds of assumptions about someone you just met. Meghan laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Oh, I'm presumptuous. That's rich coming from someone who makes a living making presumptions about other people. I make jokes, Jimmy said, his voice rising slightly. That's my job, but I don't claim to know people's personal struggles. I don't sit here and tell my guests they've never suffered. Maybe you should, Meghan said. Maybe people need to hear some truth instead of your sanitized version of reality. Jimmy shook his head. This is unbelievable. I've tried to be respectful. I've tried to keep this conversation going despite your hostility. But you seem determined to turn this into something it doesn't need to be. Hostility? Meghan's eyes widened. I'm being hostile? You invited me here just to belittle me. No one has belittled you, Jimmy said, frustration evident in his voice now. Not once. You came on this show with an agenda, and it's clear you're not interested in having an actual conversation. My agenda? Meghan stood up from her chair. My agenda is to speak truth to power, to call out hypocrisy when I see it. Jimmy remained seated, looking up at her. I'm a talk show host, not a politician. What power exactly are you speaking to? You have a platform, Meghan said. You have influence, and you use it to perpetuate a system that keeps people distracted and complacent. That's your opinion, Jimmy said calmly. But it's not fair, and it's not accurate. Of course you'd say that, Meghan snapped. You're part of the problem. The audience was completely silent now. That this had gone from uncomfortable to shocking. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, facing Meghan. Look, Jimmy said, his voice steady but firm. I've been patient. I've tried to understand where you're coming from. But you've spent this entire interview attacking me. Attacking the show, attacking what we do here. If you feel that strongly about it, maybe this isn't the right place for you. Meghan's face flushed. Are you kicking me off your show? I'm saying if you don't want to be here, you don't have to stay, Jimmy replied. Typical, Meghan said, her voice dripping with disdain. The moment someone challenges you, you shut them down. You can't handle real conversation. Jimmy took a breath. This isn't a real conversation. A real conversation requires both people to engage with respect. You haven't shown any respect since you sat down. Respect has to be earned, Meghan shot back. And you haven't earned mine. That was it. That was the moment. Those 9 words hung in the air, and everyone in the studio knew this interview was over. Jimmy nodded slowly. Okay, I think we're done here. Fine, Meghan said, pulling off her microphone. I didn't want to be here anyway. Then why did you come? Jimmy asked one final time. Meghan didn't answer. She simply turned and walked off the stage, her heels clicking against the floor in the dead silence of the studio. A production assistant rushed to follow her, looking panicked. Jimmy stood there for a moment, watching her go. Then he turned back to the audience, who sat frozen in their seats. Well, he said, running a hand through his hair, that was something. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Jimmy walked back to his desk and sat down, looking genuinely rattled for the first time in his career. I want to apologize to everyone here, Jimmy said to the audience. This is not how we do things. We invite people here to have good conversations, to connect, to share stories. I'm sorry you had to witness that. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then growing louder. They were applauding Jimmy, showing their support for how he'd handled the situation. Thank you, Jimmy said quietly. I tried. I really tried to make that work. He shuffled his note cards, trying to regain his composure. The producer's voice came through his earpiece, likely telling him what to do next. All right, Jimmy said, taking a deep breath. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we've got a great musical performance lined up. Stick around. The cameras cut, and the red lights went dark. Backstage, crew members whispered to each other, still processing what had just happened. The whole exchange from the first pointed comment to Meghan's exit had lasted less than 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Jimmy sat at his desk during the commercial break, his head in his hands. His producer approached him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You handled that perfectly, the producer said. You gave her every chance. Jimmy looked up. I don't understand what happened. I asked normal questions. I was polite. I tried to keep it light. Some people just come in with an attitude, the producer replied. Nothing you could have done differently. In her dressing room, Meghan was gathering her things. Her publicist tried to talk to her, but she waved her off. I said what I needed to say, Meghan told her publicist. He needed to hear it. The publicist looked worried. This is going to be everywhere. The video, the clips, everything. Good, Meghan said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Let people see what he's really like. But back in the studio, the audience knew the truth. They'd seen the entire interaction unfold. They'd watched Jimmy try repeatedly to have a normal, pleasant conversation. They'd watched Meghan turn every question into an attack. They'd seen her condescension, her dismissiveness, her outright rudeness. When the show came back from commercial, Jimmy had regained his composure. He introduced the musical guest with his usual enthusiasm, and the show continued. But everyone there that night knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary. The band played. The cameras rolled. Jimmy smiled and laughed and did his job. But there was a weight to it now, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. The crew noticed. The audience noticed. Everyone could feel it. Between segments, during the commercial breaks, Jimmy would glance toward the empty guest chair, the seat where Meghan had sat for those brief, tense minutes. It seemed impossible that so much conflict had erupted in such a short time. His bandleader caught his eye at one point and gave him a supportive nod. The audience had been wonderful, staying engaged despite the awkwardness, laughing at his jokes, helping him get the show back on track. They understood he'd done nothing wrong. They'd seen a host maintain his professionalism in the face of unwarranted hostility. They'd watched him extend olive branch after olive branch, only to have each one rejected. They'd observed him give someone every opportunity to turn the conversation around, to find common ground, to simply be civil. And they'd watched that person choose confrontation instead. Choose contempt over courtesy. Choose to burn a bridge that was never even built. The moment that defined the entire debacle, The moment that would be replayed and analyzed was simple. It wasn't a complex political disagreement or a clash of ideologies. It was a basic failure of human decency. Looking back at the interview, every step of the breakdown was visible. From the very first question about fan encounters, Meghan had been defensive. She'd interpreted a light-hearted question as an attack. She'd assumed the worst intentions from someone who had shown her nothing but courtesy. When Jimmy had tried to redirect to safer topics, she'd continued to push. When he'd offered her opportunities to talk about her work, she'd used them as platforms to criticize his. When he'd tried to find any common ground at all, she'd refused to meet him there. When Jimmy had asked about strange fan encounters, he'd been trying to find a lighthearted topic. When he'd asked about the podcast, he'd been giving her a chance to promote her work. When he'd suggested talking about environmental work, he'd been pivoting to something she claimed to care about. Every single attempt had been met with hostility. Every question had been treated as an insult. Every effort to connect had been rebuffed. The comment about Jimmy never struggling, about him not understanding real hardship, that had been the turning point. It was personal. It was mean. And it was based on nothing but assumptions. Jimmy had built his career on being relatable, on connecting with people from all walks of life. He'd grown up in a regular family, worked his way up through the comedy circuit, faced rejection and failure along the way. The idea that he didn't understand struggle was absurd to anyone who knew his story. But Meghan didn't know his story. She hadn't bothered to find out. She'd walked into that studio with preconceived notions and refused to let them go. The final exchange, when she declared that respect had to be earned and that Jimmy hadn't earned hers, that was when the last thread snapped. You can disagree with someone. You can have different viewpoints. But basic respect, basic courtesy, that should be the starting point, not something that has to be earned, especially when you're a guest on someone's show, especially when they've invited you into their space, given you their platform, tried to help you share your message. The lack of gratitude was astounding. The lack of basic manners even more so, especially when you're a guest on someone's show, especially when they've invited you into their space, given you their platform, tried to help you share your message. As the show ended that night and the audience filed out, they talked among themselves. They were stunned. They were confused. But mostly, they were impressed with how Jimmy had handled himself. He'd remained calm when most people would have lost their temper. He'd stayed professional when it would have been easy to match her hostility. He'd given her multiple chances to course correct before finally, reluctantly, ending the interview. And when it was over, he'd apologized to his audience, not for defending himself, not for setting boundaries, but for the uncomfortable situation they'd been forced to witness. That night became one of the most talked about moments in late-night television history, not because of a brilliant joke or a surprising revelation, but because of what it revealed about character, about grace under pressure, about knowing when to walk away. Jimmy Kimmel had shown the world how to handle a difficult situation with dignity. He demonstrated that you can stand up for yourself without being cruel, that you can end a conversation without being petty, that you can maintain your integrity even when someone else is determined to lose theirs. And Meghan Markle had shown something too. She'd shown what happens when entitlement meets reality, when someone so convinced of their own righteousness can't see their own bad behavior, when the need to be right becomes more important than being decent. In just 38 seconds, from that first cutting remark to the moment she declared Jimmy unworthy of respect, she'd managed to turn what should have been a simple interview into a masterclass in how not to conduct yourself. The clash wasn't about politics or philosophy. It was about basic human interaction. And in that arena, there was a clear winner and a very clear loser.